Thanks again to you guys here at the upper room for the invite to ask me to come back in, and glad this worked out again tonight. I was really blessed by my visit last year, so it's cool to be back. I want to just kind of pick up from where I was sharing about my trip last year. As I talked about, we were on the road for 3 months. Up to that time, I'd been in church. I was actually kind of born and raised in a church. My dad is a pastor, and I really have been involved with church ministry since junior high. I got involved with the worship team at church when I was like 13 or 14. I think, probably 14 or something. And for, a little more than 10 years, I was pretty much just serving at youth group or on worship team or those sorts of things. And I got involved in leading college ministry at our church. And after a while, I was the youth pastor for about 3 years. I was the worship leader for 4 or 5 years. So I kind of did the ministry thing a lot. And it was great. I like doing it. It's a fulfilling thing to spend your time on something that you feel like you can hopefully encourage others, and it can be a benefit to other people. But I definitely got really burnt out doing it, and that's kind of the typical story. You hear people always say like, "Oh, I got so burnt out from church and so burnt out from ministry," but it can be. A quick reason for that, I think, is that we sometimes the last people to get cared for in a church are the people who are leading, and that leaders are being cared for and are themselves being discipled is extremely important. And unfortunately, because we have a certain idea about people who lead, they're kind of serving us and ministering to us and discipling us, which is great, and that's kind of their role. But they also need that themselves because, there's not like this hierarchy of, well, this person is a superior Christian who no longer needs to be discipled and no longer needs to be cared for. And it doesn't really work that way. We kind of all together need to be caring for one another. And so burnout happens a lot when you're involved in ministry. And so we left everything. My wife and I hit the road, and it was just a time to rediscover ourselves, rediscover life and faith. It was more, those 3 months were more than just like a trip. It was really a friend of mine who's really into like Native American-y things called it a vision quest. I don't know what that is. It sounds like there's a sweat lodge involved, and I don't really like to sweat. Whatever, but that's the idea. Like we were really, we were going somewhere, but we didn't exactly know where it was, but there was purpose to what we didn't have a plan for, if that makes any sense. Like we had no ambition, we had no plans, we had no agenda, we just were out there and just like lived for the day, and that was a really amazing experience. Even just to stop here and just maybe make you think about this, like how many of you have actually lived for the day, meaning you weren't consumed with what you had going on the next week and all the plans of, well, I have the next 4 years of my life in college, and then I have, so many hours I have to do before I get vacation time. And I mean, that stuff is normal life and you have to do that. But how many of you have actually had the opportunity to just stop, and then the only thing you're aware of, the only thing your mind is on is the present moment? That is something that is not normal in our culture at all. But it's fundamental in Christianity that we are present in the moment. That's really what that prayer is for, what meditation is for, that we find ourselves just the moment. That's what sabbatical and journey is for. So that's what we were really doing, is just out there. It was really a time to help me reconnect with my faith. After burnout, you kind of start losing a little bit of like, what is it that I'm doing and why am I doing it? And when I look back on it now, I see that there was purpose in this kind of wandering that we had. And Tolkien has a line, J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote like The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings stuff. He has a line that I really like where he says, "Not all those who wander are lost." And that's kind of the title of my talk tonight. And I think that, yeah, there it is. Not all those who wander are lost. So write that down. No. So as I've been back from the road, I've been sharing a lot. This, it was about a year ago. So in the last year, I've been talking with a lot of friends about my experience, and a lot of them my age, like in the kind of young adult age, 20s or whatever. And a lot of them told me about similar experiences that they had, where they took time away from church, or they were, even though they had like a Christian background involved in the church, they were searching for meaning, and they were in the process of rediscovering faith. And it was becoming clear to me that my own personal journey was not just about me, but it was really a generational one. That there's an unrest, and then a need to search, and then a discovery. And this is kind of a collective journey. So about a year ago, after I got back, I took another position at a church as a worship leader, and it's been really great. And because obviously, it's important to be in the body and stuff with believers, and so I didn't want to be gone from that very long. So I've been involved in a church. I've also I visit other churches time to time, just not necessarily as a speaker or anything, but just to go visit. And I've kind of looked around and started realizing, like, all those people I talked to who were young people who were searching and rediscovering their faith, a lot of them weren't actually at church. They're not at the church that I go to, and they weren't at the churches I was visiting, and it kind of startled me. I didn't even realize it before, and I began wondering where my generation was. Where are all the young people? Where are the 20-somethings? And a few months ago, I came across a book called "You Lost Me." It was written by the same author who wrote Unchristian. I don't know if you've ever heard of the book Unchristian. But what the author did was he interviewed and surveyed over 50,000 young adults, 18 to 29, who had Christian upbringing. So over 50,000 young people, that's a big survey, who had Christian upbringings, Christian backgrounds. And the aim of the book was to explore why so many young people were exiting the church. And after studying all the data, the book discovered there are 3 distinct stories that were consistently reported. The first one is nomads. And nomads walk away from church engagement but still consider themselves Christian. So that was kind of the 3 months I was on the road. That was kind of a nomadic experience. I was certainly still believed, I was committed to Christ, and still holding on to faith. But I wasn't engaged in church activity for those 3 months, as I just really went on this kind of exploration, journey, whatever. Now, this is the most common they found in the survey that young Christians go through. This is 4 out of 10 go through this experience. So 4 of every 10 of the 50,000 plus people surveyed have gone through this sort of nomadic experience where they walk away from church engagement but still consider themselves Christian. Okay, so one of the reasons this happens, and I'm sure you can imagine why this happens, is because young Christians can sometimes be disillusioned with the church. They see it as a business or a bad experience or all sorts of different reasons. So they're not necessarily dissatisfied with faith, but they're dissatisfied with the church. Another common reason this occurs is because of the lack of divine encounters in the church, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. The second group of young people surveyed, 18 to 29, are prodigals. And they leave their faith completely. They lose their faith and consider themselves no longer Christian. This is 1 in every 10 that go through this experience. Now, this is interesting to me because I think, and I had this mentality, and maybe you have had it too, I've kind of always figured that when young people leave the church, that's the most normal one, is that they just give up faith, so they leave the church. But actually, that's the most infrequent season that young Christians go through, which is really encouraging and a little bit, it's kind of an interesting revelation, but there's all these young people who, for different reasons, walk away from church, but most of them actually don't walk away from their faith. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. And prodigals, this is a pretty obvious one, it can certainly be just a rebellious reaction against traditional values or more moral principles. We just want to do our own thing, and so the easiest way to do that is to leave faith. What's the verse that even says, where there's no vision, the people cast off restraint, I think is what it is. So without faith, it kind of gives you freedom to do what you want. So that's an obvious reason why people would leave the faith altogether. But I mean, it also can be, as they face new challenges in their lives and new questions about beliefs, and if they're unable to find context for dealing with those questions and finding reasonable answers and finding a place for that, the church is not a place that can meet those genuine questions and that search that young people go through. Then it can be a reason to lead to people to abandon the faith altogether. The third group are exiles. Now, these are people who are still invested in the faith, but they feel stuck or lost between culture and the church. And this is 2 out of 10 young people, 18 to 29, who've, in the survey, talked about this experience. Now, I find that for myself, so I went through that nomadic period for a few months. And that's kind of a short time frame. Most people who are in this nomadic thing tend to be in it a lot longer. I mean, I could just think of those 3 months as sabbatical. So maybe I don't qualify for that first category. But most young people, it's an extended period of time, but they're away from the church but still holding the faith. The exile is the other one. That's probably the one I probably most relate to as an artist, because, and this is I talked about this with a pastor friend of mine who really helped me understand this. There's a real tension between artists and the church a lot, and I don't know how many of you have seen that or experienced that. And there's a clear reason why, and a pastor helped me understand this, is that artists tend to be on the front end of cultural change. They're looking on the edges. Okay, what needs to be changed? What is new? What's on the outside of the territory? And that's kind of what an artist does. The church tends to be on the back end of cultural change. And by that I mean the church sees it as a responsibility to hold on to values, to slow culture down, to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, that sort of stuff, which is obviously a very good role the church has in society. So there's this tension that happens between the church with pastors and with artists. And so we kind of get this exile category, where there's a tension for people who they have one foot in the world. They're in the world, but they're also still strongly rooted in their faith, so they're not of the world. And that's that kind of tension we have. A couple examples in the Bible would be Daniel and Esther, who were serving God, being faithful, but still they were present in a foreign land. So they were dealing with a place away from the land that God had given the Israelites, but they were still deeply rooted in their faith. And they were trying to understand how they could have influence and impact and use that. They weren't just hiding from the world or from their culture, but actually having impact on their culture, the foreign culture that they were in. So the attitude of secular culture can see the church as irrelevant, while the church can sometimes see the world as an evil place that we should avoid and one day escape to heaven from the world. So this is not true, obviously, with all churches or all secular people, but that's kind of the battle lines we've drawn. The secular culture sees the church as irrelevant often, and the church sees the world as a place that we just want to hopefully, when we die, no longer have to deal with. Which, I mean, there's some truth to that, but... So the exiles still hold the value of church as a place where learning, community service, worship, etc. happen, while at the same time they relate to secular culture, usually having friends, co-workers, and family who are not Christians or who have a career in a secular field or industry. So these are the 3 distinctives that the book outlines of the type of journeys that young Christians go through. So those all make sense, right? Everyone clear with those? Also within the book, there are 6 primary issues raised that create this tension for young people. The first one is overprotective. So this is the church as an effort to become a place of sanctuary can sometimes instead shield young people from their curiosity about the world and their questions about their place in it. Where do I fit in the world? and when young people are looking to answer that question, sometimes the church, instead of trying to help understand that question, can shield from that question. So I put up there The Village, and if you guys have seen the movie The Village, I know a lot of people hate that movie. I like it a lot. I think it's pretty cool. I don't know. I like that movie, and if you haven't seen the movie, there's like this, I don't want to give it away, but it's been out for like 8 years, so, so there's like this village, and it's in it, the time, it looks like something like, I don't know, what would it be, like 17th century or something, or like very kind of Puritan sort of early, the early America kind of thing. And they find out in the end that it actually is modern day, and that they're all living in kind of this isolated camp so that they don't have to interact with the world, because the adults of this community were so scarred by their experience in the world, by violence and so on, that they wanted to create this new world for their young people to grow up in and not have to deal with the world. And that's kind of sometimes what happens in the church, is we have this kind of village type of mentality. The second one, this one was really interesting to me, especially as a worship leader, is the absence of God. That a lot of young people lament about the lack of God, or there's a lack of discipleship, that there's kind of a shallowness to church. And to kind of talk about that briefly, sometimes in an effort to be broader and wider and try to get people in the doors, which are good, once that happens, there's not necessarily somewhere else to go. Discipleship, kind of going deeper and understanding and the way that we live, and sometimes that element's not there. So I don't know anything about your church. So just to qualify, I don't know anything about the church. None of these things I'm sharing have anything to do with one particular church or the other. This is a general looking at the American church, the response of a lot of young adults. This is kind of the material that's here. So this is just kind of raw material that we're starting from. So I'm not making a commentary on the church I go to, the church you go to. This is just what's being said. Okay, the third one is anti-science. 53% of young Christians expect to have a career in the scientific or technological field, but only 9% of youth leaders have ever spoken on issues of science to their students. Now, I found this really interesting as a youth leader, because I found science is a great way to introduce apologetics in a very simple way of understanding the nature of the universe, its understanding its origins, and the need for an origin. There was, through many centuries, an idea that the universe was eternal and unchanging, which really allows for people to not need God, because of the universe is, that kind of sounds like God, is eternal and unchanging. Well, then we don't need God because the universe itself is God. But the truth is, and the newer science we've had in the last century actually reveals that no, there was a moment of creation, that there had to be a start to the universe. And of course that lends itself very nicely to God spoke, let there be. So science is a very helpful way for us to show young people how their faith fits into kind of that field, a scientific field. But there is a resistance to science, and because so many young people are going into technological or scientific fields, when we don't encounter those things in the church, it can feel a little bit unusual. How do we, bridge that gap? Subjects like New Earth, Old Earth, intelligent design, evolution, stem cell research, birth control, to name a few, are often political platforms. They're ways to get elected, just to be totally frank about it. And I mean, don't hear me wrong, I have convictions about those topics, but a lot of times we're not necessarily dialoguing about those topics and allowing people to interact with science and still hold on to faith, and that there's a place for that. We kind of only really use it to figure out who we're going to vote for come election time, which, again, I have convictions about it. The fourth thing is repression. This is attitudes about sexuality and women, or vice versa. But I don't know about the church specifically, so I apologize if I say anything out of turn. But I went through a long process in the church that I was at that had certain views about women that were difficult for me to accept, mainly because living in the time that we do, and you have, our last two Secretary of States have been women, and they're obviously they're very gifted and accomplished. I mean, Condoleezza Rice is like one of the most amazing people. Like, I don't know, some of you maybe hate her or whatever. I think she's great. And so obviously, like, we live in a culture now that understands that women have a much more important place in society than maybe they had been given in previous eras. And so it was weird for me to kind of have this view of women and then hear certain things taught to me in church, and about really extreme ways limiting their role. And that was really difficult for me as a young person. So I'm not trying to say whether or not what's the right interpretation. I'm just saying, like, the tension there that happens. And then obviously sexuality. There's a new dirty word in church, but that would be our most recent. I mean, that's been around for a while. That's like the thing you don't really talk about unless you're trying to, like, coerce young people to show up to meeting. You have this, like, kind of, bringing sexy back title and try to entice them. Oh, they're going to talk about sex, I'm going to go. And it's just this, it's a frivolous way of trying to entice young people to go to church and stuff like that. I'd just be totally honest with you. But anyway, that's another topic that young people can struggle with at times. Oh, I got to move on my time. Sorry about this. Faster. The next one is exclusivity, or just exclusive. Today's generation is more diverse and tolerant than ever before. The old dividing lines of denomination, interpretations, race, gender, way of life, etc. are less common with young people, but still can dominate the identity of religious communities. So I'll give you a quick example. If I wanted to join a Calvinist church, let's say I was going to a church and I had deep friends there, and we were in discipleship together, and then I am going to become a member here, and I go to the membership class, and they tell me, well, unless you believe strictly to our Calvinist doctrine, you can't be a member of this church. And I understand why it's important that there's a commonality in some doctrinal views within our communities. It's a strange way, I think, sometimes to divvy up where you can belong. And so sometimes if there's even that much exclusivity within Christianity itself, where, like, Calvinists and other groups of people, like, don't necessarily want to interact or whatever. I mean, how much more so for young people who are used to, I mean, I have friends who are, like I said, I have a friend who's an atheist, I have friends who are Muslim, I have friends who are homosexual, and I know all these people, and I feel like as a Christian in the world, I want to be a revelation of Jesus' love to people, to all people. And so for me, it's so weird that, like, I want to be able to invite my gay friends to church. Not that they're going to go to church where everyone's going to say it's okay, but where they're going to be able to at least step foot in the door, and that they're going to hear about the grace of God, and they're going to hear about the love of Christ. And, like, that's what I want that. So exclusivity can be a difficult thing for young people. And the last one is that the lament that the church is doubtless. This is the new dirty word. Sex is the old dirty word. Doubt is the new dirty word in the church. Too often, instead of dealing with difficult questions in the context of our faith communities, we have avoided them or even outlawed them altogether. And that's really what my new record's all about. I don't mean to pump the record or anything. It's just that's really what I was trying to say to the record, is that my faith is not a place where I avoid uncertainty, or I avoid doubt, or avoid fear, or avoid pain, or brokenness. My faith is a place where I confront those things. That it's in the face of those things that my faith is real. That it's not in the void of those things. And sometimes we have this mentality that if we're riding high and we're not dealing with any struggles, and we're not dealing with any doubt or any shame or any of those sorts of things, then we're the closest to God. But then if we go through a period where we're unsure about things, or we're struggling with things, or questions about ourselves and our humanity, then we're furthest from God. But that's a terrible way of looking at faith, because faith is it's like a marriage. I mean, you don't say, well, I'm only married to my wife when things are good, but then when things are not good, we're not married anymore. Faith is a lot more like a marriage. Whatever it is you're going through, whatever season you're in, whether you're riding high or low, God is present. That's what faith is about, and all those things. So in our church communities, we tend to avoid some of those things like doubt or fear or uncertainty. We put that to the side, we pretend it doesn't exist, or even outlaw that altogether. And this drives a lot of young people away, especially because a lot of young people are going through that. They're no longer in high school. For those of you not in high school anymore, as soon as you're done with high school and you start to interact with the real world, you're going to college, you're looking for a job, it's like all of a sudden it's like the veil is removed and you see the world in a totally new way. And so now you're rediscovering, well, what does my faith mean in all this? What is the reality of my faith in this world that I live? This is a pretty normal phase that young people go through. So I want to take a couple minutes and we'll wrap up. I want to actually get the opportunity to discuss this with you. I want to see what is it that you've heard. What are some of your thoughts on these? Anything from the three groups that we discussed, the nomads, prodigals, and the exiles, or the 6 distinct reasons that create this tension for young people. And remember, this is a survey of over 50,000 people, young people, and 7 out of 10 go through at least one of these experiences. So this is something that's really important, especially, I've been involved in lots of college ministries. This is a really important thing that we're aware of and that we're tackling, because otherwise we're not really dealing with. I mean, we're serving 3 out of 10 young people who they grew up in a Christian home, they're committed believers, and they don't struggle with anything. Which to me, I don't believe that those 3 people exist. But let's just say, according to the numbers, they do. That's only 30% of people that we're actually serving sometimes in our churches by not dealing with some of these questions. So I want to hear your feedback on this, and I want to get a few minutes of dialogue if we could. Anybody? Yes, brave soul.
I think a lot of these things, a lot of the points that you brought forth, I think a lot of them are true, but I think the emphasis doesn't need to be so much on the individual, but on the church. Mm-hmm. I think if there's a church who's willing to confront these issues, which I know plenty of churches who are very active in making sure that the young people know who God is and what He's about, and they at the same time tell them about the world. I think it's the church's responsibility for these nomads and the wonders and people becoming lost and stepping away from God. I honestly feel like that responsibility lies solely on the church and the pastors of those churches.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a lot of part of looking at this stuff is, we certainly can make, as individuals, excuses for why we don't commit to things, why we don't follow through with things. So, it's very easy for any of us to say, well, I don't like church anymore because they're repressive, or because they're exclusive, or anything. It's very easy just to, if we are serious as young people, as committed believers, then being involved in a church, even in the face of things, and not using that as an excuse to leave, obviously, so I don't want to put these things out there as if, these are all for every single person or genuine reasons. But I think you're right with what you're saying. It's the church that, I think it's less about answering questions, though, because there are things that, faith is so much about discovery for us that I really think that the church should be, and I'm just giving my own 2 cents, the church should create an environment where people can go through the process of discovering these things. Because I could give a sermon, not that or someone who's really a great theologian could give a great sermon and show why science and faith are, that science is not doesn't resist our faith and doesn't oppose our faith and blah, blah, blah. But, and that's great, and I think that it would encourage lots of people, and especially if a kid who's interested in science or whatever. But a lot of those things are a process, it takes more than just one sit down or one message that's going to resolve things for people. I think what it takes for a lot of times is it's going to take some space and some time for people for themselves, because unless you discover it for yourself, I can tell you till I'm blue in the face of something, but until the individual, it happens and takes roots deep inside someone, it's not gonna make a difference. So I mean, that would be my suggestion, is just that like, it doesn't mean that we have to back away from conviction. That's the other thing. It doesn't mean that at all. But it does, I think, mean that instead of a certain expectation that immediately, this is what you're supposed to do, this is what you're supposed to believe, understand, and do it today, otherwise we have a problem. A friend of mine jokes about it sometimes by saying the church messages, Jesus loves you, now! Which, I thought that's funny, but no, it's... Okay, and I think that's kind of true, it's like, even that, knowing the love of Christ is not something you can just like, you hear a good sermon, I mean, maybe you do hear a good sermon, that's it, but it's something that we can't like put a timeline on. Sometimes it just requires a person there's a moment where that happens. So anyway, but yeah, that's a good point. Anybody else? Sorry, I kind of rambled there.
I'm a part of, this generation. And looking back to like my friends and who I grew up with, and most of them became saved during those big type of altar calls. And now I look back, 4 or 5 years later, where are they? They're not in the church. They're not committed to this or that. I think a lot of it is that absence of God and discipleship. They get that big moment, that big rush, they get saved, but then no one follows up. Yeah. No one comes alongside with them to walk on that journey. So what happens next? And I think a lot of my friends fell into that gap of there was no one to disciple them, no one to come alongside them. So they look at the church and they say, well, there's no encounter with Christ here. I don't feel anything, I'm not experiencing anything, so what's the point? And then that's when they walk away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, real quick, there's a, and I won't get into it too much now, there's a whole message on it really, but when salvation becomes just a altar call, a moment, it's similar to a wedding. When we make when people make the ceremony the whole thing, right? Like we saw, what's her name? The Kardashian person who married the basketball player. Like the wedding, the ceremony itself was the big ordeal, right? And that's where all the energy went, all their attention went, and that's all that matters. And what happened the very next day? The wedding's over. She's no longer happy. She wants out of this marriage, and 3 months later get divorced, right? And so our faith can sometimes be like that, where we put all this emphasis on this moment. And obviously the moment's important, the moment in which we commit ourselves to Christ. But it's the day after, like a marriage, the day after, and the day after that, and the day after that. And it's the just menial activity of sometimes of just putting one foot in front of the other. And so we have a culture that doesn't understand commitment anymore. And it just obviously can look at our marriages and things like that. And faith is that way. So I think that's part of maybe why the altar call generation has had some struggles. You got a point or question?
Well, I believe there's a whole lot to it. It's a process.
Yeah.
Christianity lives in the home where it should. It's just like people go to school and they go, well, you're the teacher, teach. And they don't realize they have to be involved in their children's education. Mm-hmm. The church should live at home. Even if it doesn't live at home, guess what? They have to invest in their faith. It says, study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman not ashamed, rightly dividing the truth, rightly dividing the word of truth. And, it says, thy word have I hidden in my heart. Thy word have I hidden in my heart. Mm-hmm. I have to take a vested interest in who I am in Christ. Yeah. There's people there that can mentor them, and people that get to know in the church, and the people of their own age group or what have you, that can, that they become friends with, just like we used to say in military, civilian life, they say in or out. Well, it's civilian life and military life. You meet friends wherever. And they have to realize that the altar call is great. And they find out and they have this epiphany, if you would. Sure. The thing is, I don't feel safe, somebody told me once. I said, well, what's it mean you don't feel safe? You don't have that adrenaline rush, you don't have that emotional connection. I said, this is, reading the Word of God is where the rubber hits the road. You have to know who you are in Christ, what you believe, why you believe, and where do I go from here? Mm-hmm. All this business of, in our society, if it feels good, do it, or,
sure.
any type of rationalization for one's behavior. But they have to know that there's a whole process to it, and they have to invest themselves into what they believe and why they believe.
Right.
You know, it's the altar call is just the very, very tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
You know, we're not guided by feelings. We're guided by we are saved by grace through faith.
Yeah.
I think too along that same lines that people need to be accountable and responsible. And I've taught my kids that the church is a community. It's people all together. If the young people leave because they're not being entertained or they feel that no one is reaching out to them, it's their responsibility too to have input. When they pull themselves away, they're taking part of that community with them. That other people need to be seeing them present in church. And the pastor's a man, and he can bring the message, but you're not there to be entertained. You're there to participate. And if you don't get anything out of it, that's your responsibility. And I think that's a lot of not just the young people, but anyone at this time period, that they need to take responsibility to be accountable for themselves and not stop blaming the church, the pastor. It's their responsibility to participate.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that for all of us, and it's that's you'd like people to understand it early. That tends to be a more mature understanding that the responsibility on ourselves. I don't think it's a matter of blaming the church or young people just finding excuses to walk away. I think it's really seeing the tension between what young people are. There are things that are going on in young people's experiences in their lives, in their minds, in their encounter with wherever it is that they're at, at school or with their friends or whatever, that sometimes the church can be oblivious to. And I think it's just really being aware of those things, because if you're a young person and you don't find that the church is a place where you're learning how to deal with those big questions in life, and deal with how you interact with the world and where your place is in the world, and what your faith is really about. The whole thing about entertaining to me is, and my feeling just in seeing a lot and traveling, is that I think though we can't put so much effort on enticing people through entertainment and then lament when we don't have discipleship. I've heard so many people, I've talked to a lot of pastors who said discipleship is the most important thing. And it's like, okay, that's great. But then why is everything that you do in your church all about entertaining people and, having like the big, bright band, light stage, and rocking out with their, sweet, cool clothes and their awesome hairdos like a rock concert, and then the pastor is out there and doing a whole like theatrical sort of thing, and you have all these events for kids where they're collecting Easter eggs. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but when we use that to entice people, and then we go like, well, why aren't we seeing discipleship happen? It's because we're lying to ourselves, because we're telling ourselves discipleship is the most important thing. But what we actually do, what's actually visible to people, what we do on Sunday mornings, blah, blah. That's the real indication of what we value. So I'm just being honest, because I've had that experience, even growing up in the church, is I lament going like, I want to be discipled. Like, I want to know the deep stuff about walking with Christ and how I should live. I'm just sick of the rock concert. I'm sick of, that's just me personally, because I've been part of that so much. There's so much more that can be done, I think, in a genuine sit-down Bible study than when you're in a theater and the worship band is so loud that you can't hear anything else, and everyone just like claps and goes home. And probably pay $20 to be there. Like, that stuff to me is just, unfortunately, a lot of American, I'm not saying it's everybody or all churches or whatever, but that's a lot of our American church now. And so we've kind of created our own problems, what I believe. And there's a lot of people smarter than me who are writing about these things. And my daddy's been a pastor for 25 years, whatever. He saw that progression through the 80s and 90s too. We put on a good show, but now we're wondering why we don't have any disciples. And again, that's not true all over the place, but just a generality. Dallas Willard, as a quick note, writes really brilliant material on this subject too. He's actually a philosophy professor at USC. He's a theologian and a pastor and just a brilliant guy. He writes a lot about how we're kind of going through a national movement away from the bigger show and into more of the one-on-one discipleship and how important that is. So anyway, we should probably wrap it up pretty soon. Yeah, it's 7:55. So, well, I just wanted to kind of put this stuff out there because this is what I've been going through. I wanted to give you something that was kind of one authentic to where I'm at as a person, just my own kind of going through a reclaiming of my faith and rediscovering my faith. And two, because it's here, your college ministry, I think this information is really important to understand because we have to know who it is that we're reaching to, who it is we're ministering to. And it's not a matter of dividing lines between, well, it's this rebellious generation, and they look at the church and say, well, it's the irrelevant church, or blah, blah. It's not about creating dividing lines. It's about knocking those things down, wiping those things away. So that church can be a vibrant place where young people can discover faith. And I think that's what's really, really the heart of it.